So greetings, everybody. Namaskar. In my tradition, we say Jai Shri Radhe. So we will be meeting again soon in I think a couple of weeks. I can't remember exactly when. At the end of August, but Laura will remind me, no doubt. To study with you one of my favorite topics, which is the history of yoga. So to get a sense of course, most of us know in the yoga communities outside of India, we know about the sutras of Patanjali. And we might recall the very, very first verse. Patanjali says, Ata Yoga Anu Shasadam. Anu in Sanskrit means to continue. Patanjali says he's continuing these teachings. He's not claiming to be inventing a new method. So we'll be looking at, well, what's he we'll be asking the question, what is he continuing these teachings from? And so we'll be looking at expressions of yoga, Patanjali and like yoga, not because different forms of yoga. We're looking at the sort of Chitta Vritti Nirodha yoga, the stilling of the mind sort of yoga. And we'll be looking at it in other sources, some of them earlier than Patanjali, such as the Upanishads. We'll be looking at a couple of passages much older than Patanjali, the Katha Upanishad and the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. We'll be looking at the Gita, where Krishna says, well, there's two kinds of yoga. There's action yoga, and then there's the inaction yoga. So we'll be, try and get a little bit of a sense of this, the two types of yoga. Obviously, Patanjali is one of those two, and then and Krishna is going to be contrasting it with another type, which he's actually promoting in the Gita, which is action yoga. So we'll be looking at yoga in the Gita. And then a quick glance at Vedanta. What does Vedanta have to say? What does the Vedanta tradition has to say? What do they have to say? Their interest is in Brahman, or the nature of Brahman. So what do they have to say about yoga? How does yoga fit into their project? So we look at quick look at a couple of verses in Vedanta. If we have time, maybe one verse from Nyaya, the logicians, right? The hardcore rationalists. Well, what do they have to say about yoga? Do they accept yoga? So they certainly do. But they have a brief, they briefly endorse yoga in one of the verses. If we have time, we'll look at that. And finally, we'll conclude the workshop with, so those are all philosophical texts. They're all scholarly texts. They're for scholastics. Most Hindus don't read any of those texts. They read the stories, which of course transmit the philosophy, but in the beautiful story form. So we'll be reading the story of the very first yogi, according to Hinduism, and that's Brahma. Not Brahman, Brahma. He's one of these celestial beings and considered to the first created being. He's considered to be the very first person to undergo Chitta Vritti Nirodha yoga. So we'll be looking at his story, and so lots of, so we'll be getting different flavors then of yoga over and above the one that we're mostly familiar with in the form of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So we have 6 hours workshop, I think Saturday and Sunday. And then Laura's asked me on Friday to give a little bit of a background introduction, not reading the texts, but talking about what's the relationship between these texts, which comes first, which comes, what's the relationship in this sort of network of texts within which we find Patanjali. Where does Patanjali place himself, or where is he placed in this larger context? So we'll talk about that on Friday for an hour or two. And that's optional if anybody wants to join us for that. And if you miss that, that's okay, because the actual workshop will be just reading the actual text themselves. And finally, I've offered to do a question and answer. We don't have a lot of time, especially because it's being translated. So that means what time is cut in half. So 6 hours becomes 3 hours, because I have to stop and by the way, we're very, very fortunate and grateful to Gabriel Martino for translating for us. He's a scholar, wonderful scholar in his own right, at the University of Buenos Aires, and he's an expert in Greek philosophy, especially Plotinus. He's a mystic. The mystical philosophy. Well, I don't know if he would use that term. But anyway, he's a scholar in his own right, but also in the yoga tradition. He's writing on the yoga tradition. So very grateful to have him. But anyway, so our time isn't that much. given that we have to have it for translation. So we'll be keeping our questions and answers for a separate session. Again, that's optional. And I don't know when we'll do that. Laura will decide whether we do it after Sunday or whether we do it on Monday in a separate session. We can figure that out later. Okay, so that's our project, and look forward to meeting you all on Zoom. Little boxes up on the top of my screen, and in the meantime, Jai Sri Krishna, Jai Sri Radhe, Namaskar.